Hello everyone and welcome to the Topical Hour. Secret Invasion has finally been brought to a conclusion, and if you want an analogy to how it went down, it's a lot like COD Vanguard. I had virtually no expectations and was really let down by the quality of the show even still. And there's a few reasons for that, many actually. But I think the first and foremost reason is that this series is not really Secret Invasion at all. The MCU is kind of known now for making really huge scale stories feel dumb, just as it did with Civil War, and just as it's most likely going to do with Secret Wars. All of these events that I'm talking about are events of an enormous scale that were built towards properly, whereas this show really only requires you to have watched Captain Marvel before it, and only barely in that regard. This MCU trend of minimizing enormous stories is starting to get annoying because it really botches what the stories are going for in the first place. Anyone who's read the Civil War comic almost feels disrespected by you just attaching the Civil War title to a Captain America story. Similarly here, we have a watered down version of Secret Invasion whose title they only used because the very base premise kind of matches. Even though the only real twist came with Rhodey being a Skrull, and at least half of us knew that before the show released. It's becoming clear that the MCU wants to pretend that it's on a bigger scale than it is, and it keeps botching stories trying to prove that lie. And even then, in this new multiverse saga, the primary thing people are complaining about is that it's essentially too big for its britches. But that's another large-scale conversation. As for how this show suffers from it, we have about 4 characters in this show from previous MCU stuff. One of them dies immediately, one of them isn't who we think he is anyway, and the third dies a bit later. And that literally just leaves Fury and the enemy, and Gaia and Sonya. This show goes so hard for the shock factor at the end of each episode that it starts sacrificing its own characters just to get you to keep watching. As for the characters we are left with, they don't really get any thematics to dabble with. Gaia just seems like a young, naive idiot who can't decide why she wants to fight for her father, even though she continues to do exactly that. We don't get any depth from her in the slightest. Sonya's the same way, although she's almost more of a comedic relief, but I think she's acted so well that complaining about her character would make it seem like she isn't cool, which she is. Talos is probably the most disappointing character. After Captain Marvel, he was the only part of the movie that everyone kinda liked, so much so that it was pretty obvious he was going to die at some point in the series. Now, I'm the last person to say that established characters should get some kind of special treatment just because, coming from someone who hated The Last of Us 2. I really liked Talos, and it felt like not only was his death just for shock value, which already wastes his character, but it was done in such a disrespectful way. Like, why was he shot by some random goon and then Gravik somehow got behind enemy lines just to bring him to Fury to watch him die? Not only that, but even wounded, Talos wouldn't trust some random guy. It sounds really ridiculous on paper, which baffles me even more that someone must have written that on paper on purpose. And that's just Talos' death. We haven't even covered Maria Hill. Now, whether or not the first episode tried to trick you with her death scene as it happened was also seriously disrespectful. It literally dumbs down the character just to add more shock value to the television show. Not only that, but there was like a lot more to her character that was never touched on at all. Like, we spend 2 episodes talking about how Talos and Fury have been friends for decades, but if you asked anyone before watching this show, Maria Hill is way closer with Fury than Talos. And she's proven to be a master strategist and pretty much as paranoid and prepared as Fury himself. Remember when Fury almost died in Winter Soldier and she was like on top of it? I know she's not the same person as years before, but show us that in more than 1 episode. And then for the big man himself, Nick Fury. Fury is probably the most undercooked character of the entire show, and the wasted potential here is enormous. We start off with him reuniting with his friends with no real reasoning for why he was gone or why he came back. And as a small tangent, it's not explained very well what resources Fury does or doesn't have. Like, he and his team have special glasses and cars and guns, but they also aren't able to travel anywhere much faster than the average civilian. But I know that a big reason Fury seems so unprepared this season is because we're supposed to understand that the blip affected him more than we thought. Being unprepared to die like that with Maria Hill on that street was probably a terrifying experience. So now he's a different person than he was. Now, bear with me, but there's a way to resolve all of the problems with Secret Invasion. I think that if Nick Fury was so affected by being unprepared to die, that he should be a million times more paranoid now. He should have backup plans for his backup plans, and it would be way more interesting to see him slowly lose his sanity and his trust for his friends as the show goes on, because he's afraid of being unprepared again. And then when he loses both Talos and Maria and his wife turns out to be a Skrull and tries to kill him and it justifies his fear, it would be a wildly entertaining arc to watch him be able to trust people again. Now, that premise isn't perfect, but what we got is garbage, I'm disappointed to say. The story struggles to have twists and turns like its comic counterpart without doing all of the work necessary to set up an event like this. And out of all the characters that turn out to be Skrulls in some kind of twist, only one of them is an established character. And it's Rhodey. He doesn't even wear the suit in the show, he just talks about it. To me, Marvel heard a lot of the complaints they've been getting recently. There's a little bit less CGI, some decently choreographed fight scenes besides the last episode. But then they forgot what they've already been doing semi-successfully. There's no humor, there's no stakes, there's barely any characters. Although Marvel has been doing pretty good with the villains in their shows, aside from Falcon and Winter Soldier, the villain in this show is also awful. He's one of those villains you get every few years that's always somehow ahead of the heroes at every turn and some kind of threat to the free world as we know it. Kinda like a COD villain. But, when you ask me, we should have leaned into this even more. This show likes to throw around the term World War III a lot, and I think it should have played out a lot more like the Cold War. Minimal firefights, spies on both sides. Instead, we get a firefight every episode, and the villain is so smart and Fury is so dumb that they have to constantly make excuses for why Gravik spares him. Oh man, we could kill the single biggest threat to our survival, but why bother? I recently made a video on the best Marvel show ever, which is by far and none Daredevil, and this show is garbage compared to that masterpiece. It's garbage compared to the rest of the MCU. I mean, the whole entire point of inventing superhero movies was to bring comics to life and put superpowers on the big screen. I'm fine with not having action scenes every 2 seconds, but the lack of action needs to be replaced with any kind of tension. This show fails in that regard. It fails to justify its characters, it fails the comic it's based on, and it fails the MCU. There are very few things I've gotten this little amount of joy from, and this is by far in the top 3 worst MCU projects. I still think Quantumania and Love and Thunder are more embarrassing and annoying, but they're also not 3 times the length of the average movie. And also, as we start to wrap this up, I find it hysterical that people were complaining about the show intro being generated by AI. First of all, the opening theme actually genuinely slaps, and admittedly the AI does fit in at least marginally with the subject material at hand. But I will acknowledge that if Marvel ever tries to pull this AI stuff ever again, it shouldn't be tolerated. And even then, it's made more embarrassing by the fact that the show feels procedurally generated with no real rhyme or reason. And just like most AI, it does the most random thing and makes the young, naive character the most powerful in the MCU. I'm simply baffled by that decision. You're literally fighting to negate the entire point of every character in your franchise, and you're wondering why people are choosing to leave as of right now. But as for the number score, this show gets a crisp 2.5 out of 10. It's exactly as I said earlier. It fails its characters, the MCU, and the Secret Invasion storyline. It gets all 2.5 of those points from Talos and Sonya, and even then, I am being quite generous. I'm sure some of you out there think that I'm being too harsh, and maybe I am. I acknowledge that I could be. But it's only because this show would genuinely make the MCU better if it didn't exist, and it wasted such a cool premise that it's genuinely insulting. It's kinda sad how this show just limped by, to the point that everyone was wondering what was going to happen next, only because they had to keep making up more story as time went on. Maybe it would have been better as a movie, maybe not. But either way, Secret Invasion just doesn't work as an MCU project at this point in time, and it's a bit depressing just how badly they wasted this story and spent hundreds of millions of dollars on something no one wanted or enjoyed. And like I said, if you think I'm being too harsh, you enjoying this show does not change its low quality nature in the slightest. Anyway, if you enjoyed the video, make sure to like and subscribe so you can catch the next one. Or not, that's fine. Play nice, people.